The global security system that for decades rested on rules, treaties, and informal restraints is now increasingly coming apart at the seams, and the recent incident involving the detention of a Russian oil tanker by French naval forces has become yet another alarming signal of how quickly the world is sliding into a new phase of confrontation. What only a few years ago seemed unthinkable, direct use of force by states against civilian shipping under the pretext of sanctions enforcement, is today becoming almost routine. France, acting within the EU sanctions regime, stopped a tanker in the Mediterranean Sea that, according to Western authorities, belongs to the so-called Shadow Fleet and was used to transport Russian oil in circumvention of restrictions. The vessel was inspected, the crew detained for verification, and the tanker itself escorted to a French port for further investigation. Formally, Paris emphasizes that this was not an attack on Russia, but the enforcement of international sanctions and norms of maritime law. However, in Moscow, this episode is perceived very differently. According to sources close to Russian decision-making circles, the detention of the tanker is seen as a dangerous precedent that destroys the remaining trust and shifts economic confrontation into the realm of force. Experts note that such actions blur the line between sanctions enforcement and an actual naval blockade, which constitutes a direct challenge to the principles of freedom of navigation on which global trade has been built for decades. For this reason, analysts believe Russia's response will not be limited to diplomatic notes and statements. According to insiders, options for retaliatory steps are already being discussed in Moscow, which may not be symmetrical, but are intended to show that such actions will not go unanswered. These may include expanding measures to protect Russian shipping, strengthening tanker escorting in sensitive regions, as well as legal and political initiatives on international platforms. At the same time, it is emphasized that Russia is not interested in a direct military clash with NATO, but neither is it prepared to tolerate further pressure without a response. This incident fits into a broader context of global fragmentation, where the world is increasingly dividing into blocs and former rules are losing their universal character. Western countries more often act according to the logic of the force of law, while Russia and its partners speak ever more loudly about the law of force as a forced response to unilateral actions. As a result, each such episode, whether the detention of a tanker, interception of cargo, or a sanctions investigation, becomes not merely an isolated event, but part of a larger chain of escalation. Analysts warn that if this practice continues, the world's oceans could turn into a zone of constant risk, where commercial vessels become hostages to geopolitics. Particularly troubling is the fact that countries that until recently positioned themselves as guarantors of stability are increasingly involved in these processes. France, one of the key players in the EU and NATO, has effectively demonstrated its readiness to use force to defend the sanctions regime, thereby raising the stakes for all participants. In Moscow, this is seen as a signal that the phase of compromise has ended and a period of hard testing of the limits of what is permissible has begun. According to sources, the Russian response will be calibrated so as not to provoke immediate escalation, while at the same time demonstrating determination to defend national interests. This is the core danger of the current moment. The world is moving further away from predictability, and each side is acting according to the logic of if not us, then against us. The tanker incident has become yet another confirmation that the global security system is no longer coherent and that international law is increasingly applied selectively. And the more such episodes accumulate, the higher the risk that at some point the chain of retaliatory measures will spiral out of control, turning economic and sanctions-based confrontation into open conflict whose consequences will no longer be containable. Against this backdrop, a growing number of experts agree that the tanker detention incident is not an exception and not a one-off action, but a symptom of a deep shift in the global security architecture, in which previous agreements no longer function automatically. The world is entering a phase in which each major player increasingly interprets international law through the prism of its own interests, and the boundary between legitimate control and coercive pressure becomes ever more blurred. Under such conditions, any detention of a civilian vessel acquires not only legal but also powerful political significance, turning into a signal to all others. Analysts stress that what is particularly alarming is the normalization of such actions. If not long ago similar incidents caused shock and emergency diplomatic consultations, today they are discussed almost routinely as part of a new reality. This, observers note, is the most dangerous moment, when escalation ceases to be perceived as an exception and becomes the background. In Moscow, according to sources, close attention is being paid not only to France's reaction, but also to that of other European capitals, assessing whether the EU is prepared to go further and expand the practice of interceptions and inspections. Analysts believe that the nature of Russia's response will depend precisely on this. The issue is not so much about symmetrical measures as about building its own deterrent system in which allies, alternative supply routes, and intensified legal pressure on international platforms will play a key role. In parallel, voices are growing louder that the world's oceans are turning into an arena of a new type of confrontation, not frontal but fragmented, where each side tests the limits of what is permissible, avoiding direct clashes but constantly raising the stakes. In this context, experts increasingly compare what is happening to the Cold War, but with an important caveat. Then, there were clear dividing lines and unwritten rules, whereas today, these lines are blurred and the rules are contested. This is precisely what makes the situation more unstable and less predictable. France, by detaining the tanker, is formally acting within the framework of the EU's collective policy, but de facto assumes the role of an enforcer ready to use force. This automatically increases the risk of retaliatory steps, not only from Russia, but also from other countries that are closely watching the precedents. Analysts warn that if the practice of detentions expands, it may push states toward creating new mechanisms to protect shipping, including escorts and alternative insurance and settlement systems. In the long term, this will lead to fragmentation of global trade, where different routes serve different political blocs. Such a scenario would mean the end of globalization in its previous form and a transition to a world divided not only politically, but also logistically. In this sense, the tanker incident looks like one of the first visible markers of this transition. And the longer the chain of mutual steps and responses continues, the harder it becomes to return to the previous level of trust. Experts emphasize that even if the specific investigation ends without high-profile consequences, the residue of what happened will not disappear. It will accumulate, feeding distrust and readiness for harsher scenarios in the future. As a result, the world is moving ever faster toward a state in which security ceases to be a shared value and turns into an object of bargaining and pressure. This is precisely the main risk of the current moment. Each subsequent incident becomes not a step toward de-escalation, but another stone in the wall of a new global divide, the consequences of which may prove far deeper and longer lasting than it seems today.